Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. In the late summer of 1839, the Hartwell plantation stretched across 900 acres of tobacco fields in Virginia's Piedmont region. The estate, with its imposing white columns and oak-lined avenue, stood as a monument to the wealth extracted from the labor of 63 enslaved people. On August 14th of that year, plantation owner Samuel Hartwell ordered that a man named Isaiah, 28 years old, and known among the enslaved community for his quiet dignity, be bound to wooden posts in the eastern cornfield as punishment. 4 days later, when overseers approached at dawn, they discovered something that would perplex investigators for over a century. Isaiah had vanished completely, leaving only severed ropes and a mystery that defied all explanation. The circumstances leading to this punishment, as later revealed through documentary evidence, began 3 days prior to the binding, when Isaiah was discovered in possession of what plantation records described as contraband material. The Plantation Ledger, a leather-bound volume discovered in 1923 by Professor Herman Walsh, a researcher from the University of Virginia conducting an examination of antebellum agricultural records, contained a detailed entry dated August 11, 1839, documenting the alleged transgression that would seal Isaiah's fate. The entry, written in the careful script of the plantation's overseer, stated that Isaiah had been found with a hand-drawn map in his possession, a crude but unmistakable rendering of the roads leading north from the Hartwell estate toward the Rappahannock River and beyond. Such maps were explicitly forbidden among the enslaved population, as they represented the clearest evidence of intention to escape, and the ledger noted that the discovery had been made during a routine inspection of the quarters. The same entry provided a physical description of Isaiah that painted a picture of a man whose very presence commanded attention. Standing 6 feet and 7 inches tall, with broad shoulders and hands described as capable of felling timber, he represented an imposing figure among the 63 individuals held in bondage on the property. According to witness accounts recorded years later, Samuel Hartwell had declared before the assembled enslaved population that Isaiah would be bound in the eastern cornfield, visible to all, serving as a stark warning of the consequences awaiting those who dared contemplate defiance. The details of how Isaiah was bound to the wooden structure in the cornfield emerged decades after the event itself, preserved in testimony that would not be recorded until the aftermath of the Civil War had fundamentally altered the landscape of the South. In 1867, during depositions collected by the Freedmen's Bureau in Madison County, Virginia, a woman named Patience Carmichael, formerly enslaved on the Hartwell plantation, provided an account of the binding that she had witnessed as a young woman of 19. Her testimony, preserved in the National Archives and discovered by researchers in 1954, described the elaborate and deliberate nature of Isaiah's restraint in language that conveyed both the horror of what she had seen and the precision with which it had been carried out. According to Patience's deposition, Samuel Hartwell had ordered 2 of his overseers to construct a wooden frame specifically for this purpose, a structure that bore unsettling resemblance to the Scarecrow frames used throughout the plantation's fields, with a central post driven 5 feet into the earth and crossbeams extending outward at shoulder height on either side. The testimony stated that Isaiah's wrists had been bound to these crossbeams using thick hemp rope, the kind typically reserved for securing heavy loads to wagons, with multiple wrappings that left no possibility of movement or escape through ordinary means. His ankles, Patience recalled, had been secured separately to 2 additional posts driven into the ground approximately 3 feet apart, forcing Isaiah to remain upright, but preventing him from achieving any position of comfort or rest. The placement of this structure in the eastern cornfield had been, as the deposition made clear, a calculated decision on Hartwell's part, positioned at a point where the slight elevation of the land made the bound man visible, both from the main house, with its wide veranda, and from the quarters where the enslaved population was housed, ensuring that Isaiah's punishment would serve its intended purpose as a warning to all who might harbor similar thoughts of resistance or escape. Patience's testimony further noted that the overseers had been given explicit instructions to approach the site twice each day, at sunrise and again at sunset, carrying water that Isaiah would be permitted to drink, but offering no food, no shelter from the August sun, and no relief from the position in which he had been secured. The first full day of Isaiah's punishment, August 15, 1839, unfolded beneath a merciless summer sun that bore down upon the Hartwell plantation with the kind of oppressive heat that made the very air seem to shimmer above the tobacco fields. The routines of the estate continued, as they always had, with the enslaved population moving through their assigned tasks under the watchful eyes of overseers who carried both whips and the authority to use them. Yet something had shifted in the atmosphere of the place, a tension that hung over the fields like the humidity that preceded a thunderstorm. The workers in the tobacco rows, bent low among the broad leaves as they performed the endless labor of suckering and worming, moved through their tasks within direct sight of the eastern cornfield, where Isaiah remained bound to his wooden frame, and those who later spoke of that day recalled an unusual silence that had settled over the fields, broken only by the occasional bark of an overseer's command or the distant call of crows circling overhead. The evidence of how this first day affected those within the main house itself came to light more than a century later, when a collection of family papers belonging to the Hartwell estate was donated to the Virginia Historical Society in 1956 by a descendant living in Maryland. Among these papers was a letter dated August 15, 1839, written in the elegant script of Margaret Pemberton Hartwell to her sister, Catherine, who resided in Richmond. The letter, which touched upon various matters of household management and social obligations, mentioned Isaiah's punishment only in passing, but the few sentences devoted to the subject carried a weight that suggested deeper concerns. Margaret wrote that her husband had seemed particularly agitated throughout the evening, pacing the length of the veranda long after darkness had fallen, pausing occasionally to stare out toward the eastern fields, though nothing could be seen in the blackness beyond the house. She noted that Samuel had consumed more whiskey than was his custom, and that when she had attempted to speak with him about a matter concerning the household staff, he had responded with uncharacteristic sharpness before retreating to his study. The letter concluded this brief mention with a sentence that historians would later find particularly significant. Margaret confessed to her sister that something about the entire affair troubled her in a way she could not quite articulate, a feeling of unease that had settled upon her and refused to lift. The official records of the Hartwell plantation made no mention of what occurred during the night hours of August 15th and 16th, but evidence gathered from other sources suggests that several individuals among the enslaved population risked severe punishment by defying the explicit orders that no one was to approach Isaiah's bound form outside the designated times when overseers brought water. These acts of defiance, small but significant in their courage, were documented indirectly through the observations of an outsider who happened to be present on the plantation during those critical days. Reverend John Matthews, a traveling Methodist minister who made regular circuits through the counties of central Virginia, arrived at the Hartwell estate on the afternoon of August 16th, as was his custom during the summer months when he would stop at various plantations to conduct religious services for both the enslaved population and, when invited, for the planter families themselves. His diary, a detailed daily record that he maintained throughout his ministerial career, and which was donated to the archives of the Virginia Historical Society by his descendants in 1891, contains an entry for August 16, 1839, that provides a rare glimpse into the atmosphere that had settled over the plantation. The Reverend wrote that upon his arrival, he had immediately sensed something unusual in the demeanor of the people he encountered, a quality he described as a profound quietness that seemed to extend beyond the normal reserve expected of enslaved individuals in the presence of white visitors. During the evening service he conducted in the small chapel that stood near the quarters, Matthews noted that he had overheard fragments of whispered conversations among the assembled congregation, words spoken so softly that he could not make out their full meaning, but which seemed to reference keeping watch or maintaining vigil. The diary entry concluded with an observation that would prove particularly significant when examined by later historians. The minister wrote that he sensed an undercurrent of tension pervading the entire plantation, a feeling that something of great consequence was unfolding just beneath the surface of the daily operations and routines, though he confessed he could not quite grasp what that something might be, nor could he determine whether the tension he perceived represented danger, hope, or something else entirely beyond his understanding as an outsider to the complex and hidden world of plantation life. The second day of Isaiah's punishment, August 16th, brought no relief from the oppressive heat that continued to blanket the Virginia Piedmont, with temperatures that sent field workers to seek whatever shade could be found during the brief respite allowed at midday, and caused even the most hardened overseers to wipe sweat from their brows as they made their rounds through the tobacco fields. The overseer's daily log, a leather-bound record book that survived in remarkably good condition and was later acquired by the Library of Virginia in 1932, contains an entry for this date that provides crucial details about Isaiah's condition and the increasingly strange circumstances surrounding his confinement. The log, written in the terse, functional style typical of such documents, recorded that Isaiah had remained conscious and alert throughout the entirety of the second day, showing no signs of the collapse or delirium that might have been expected, given his exposure to the relentless sun and his inability to move from his bound position. More remarkable, however, was the notation that when the overseer approached at midday with water, Isaiah had refused to drink, turning his head away when the dipper was brought to his lips, an act of defiance, or perhaps of resignation, that the overseer found significant enough to document in the permanent record. The entry continued with an observation that the overseer clearly considered worthy of note, despite its apparent irrelevance to the human drama unfolding in the cornfield. Several crows had begun circling above the area where Isaiah was bound, their numbers increasing throughout the afternoon until perhaps a dozen of the blackbirds wheeled in the sky above the eastern field, occasionally landing on the crossbeams of the wooden frame itself before taking flight again. This behavior, the log noted, was highly unusual for the species and for the location, as crows typically avoided areas of human activity and habitation. By evening, as the second day drew to a close, the natural world seemed to mirror the tension that had settled over the plantation, with dark clouds gathering along the western horizon above the distant peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, their purple-gray masses building with the promise of a summer storm that might finally break the heat, though whether such a storm would bring relief or only add to the suffering of the man bound in the field remained to be seen. The true nature of what had been unfolding at the Hartwell plantation during the late 1830s remained hidden for nearly a century and a half, buried beneath layers of time, soil, and the carefully maintained silences of those who knew the truth but carried it to their graves. In the spring of 1978, when the Virginia Department of Transportation announced plans to construct a new highway through Madison County, state regulations required an archaeological survey be conducted along the proposed route, which happened to pass directly through what had once been the grounds of the Hartwell estate. The survey team, led by Dr. Sarah Chen from the College of William and Mary, began systematic excavation in April of that year, carefully documenting foundations of long-vanished structures and cataloguing artifacts of daily life that had accumulated in the soil. During examination of what had once been the formal garden area, located on the southern side of where the main house had stood before its destruction by fire in 1893, the team uncovered something that would fundamentally alter understanding of the events of August 1839. Buried approximately 18 inches beneath the surface, wrapped in deteriorated oilcloth and protected by a small wooden box constructed of cedar, was a collection of letters that had been deliberately hidden. The letters, 14 in total, were written in 2 distinctly different hands. The first, appearing on 7 letters, displayed the careful, educated script typical of upper-class women of the antebellum period, each signed only with the initial M and dated between March 1837 and July 1839. The second hand, appearing on the remaining 7 letters, showed less practiced penmanship but determined clarity, the writing of someone who had acquired literacy as an adult, and while these letters bore no signature, the name Isaiah appeared multiple times throughout their text. Carbon dating analysis conducted at the University of Virginia confirmed that the paper and ink dated to the period between 1835 and 1840, and the content of the correspondence revealed a relationship between the 2 writers that had clearly been developing in secret for at least 2 years before the events of August 1839, a connection that transcended not merely social convention, but the brutal boundaries of enslavement itself. The third day of Isaiah's ordeal, August 17th, brought developments within the main house that would later be viewed as significant pieces of a larger puzzle, though at the time they appeared to be merely unfortunate coincidences unrelated to the punishment being carried out in the eastern cornfield. The plantation ledger for that date contains an entry that stands out among the routine notations of supplies purchased and tasks completed. Margaret Hartwell had reportedly taken ill during the night and confined herself to her chambers, refusing visitors and requesting that meals be brought to her room rather than joining her husband at the dining table, as was her custom. The household account book, a separate record maintained by the head housekeeper and discovered among estate papers in the same 1956 donation that yielded Margaret's letters, shows that the cook received specific instructions that morning to prepare only light broths and herbal teas for the mistress of the house, the kind of fare typically reserved for those suffering from fever or stomach ailments. While Margaret remained sequestered in her chambers, Isaiah continued his 3rd day, bound to the wooden frame in the cornfield, his body now entering a state of exposure that would begin to take a serious toll on even the strongest constitution. The overseer's log for August 17th noted that the unusual congregation of crows above the cornfield had increased substantially, with the birds now numbering perhaps 24 or more, their constant circling and cawing creating a disturbance that drew the attention of field workers throughout the day. The log specifically recorded that 3 individuals had to be disciplined for repeatedly stopping their work to look toward the eastern field, their fascination with whatever was occurring there apparently strong enough to risk punishment. As evening approached and the 3rd day drew toward its close, the storm that had been threatening on the western horizon finally arrived, though not in the manner that might have brought relief. The dark clouds that had built throughout the afternoon veered to the east as they crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains, passing south of the plantation and leaving behind only distant thunder that rumbled across the darkening sky and occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the horizon but brought no rain to the parched tobacco fields. The fourth day, August 18th, began with an unusual quietness that seemed to blanket the entire plantation, a stillness that even the birds appeared to respect, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of what was about to be discovered. The overseer's log entry for that morning, written in a hand that showed signs of agitation evident in the irregular pressure of the pen strokes, states that he and 2 other men, both trusted members of the plantation's supervisory staff, had approached the eastern cornfield at first light to assess Isaiah's condition before the day's work commenced, and the enslaved population was released from the quarters to begin their labor. What these 3 men discovered in those early morning hours, when mist still clung to the low places in the fields and the sun had barely cleared the horizon, would become the central mystery that local authorities, state officials, and eventually historians could never satisfactorily resolve, despite decades of investigation and speculation. The wooden frame to which Isaiah had been bound stood exactly as it had been constructed, completely intact with no sign of tampering or structural damage, the posts still firmly driven into the ground at precisely the angles and depths they had occupied for the previous 4 days. The crossbeams remained solid and unchanged, showing no indication that force had been applied to them in any way that might have facilitated an escape. However, the thick hemp ropes that had secured Isaiah's wrists to those crossbeams now lay severed on the ground, the cut ends showing a clean break that suggested they had been sliced through with a very sharp blade rather than frayed or torn through struggle or gradual weakening. Isaiah himself was gone, vanished as completely as if he had never been there at all, with no footprints visible in the soil leading away from the wooden frame, no disturbance in the surrounding rows of corn that might indicate which direction he had taken, and no trace whatsoever of his presence except for the cut ropes and a single item lying in the dirt near the base of the central post, an object so small that the overseer initially overlooked it entirely in his shock at discovering the impossible scene before him. Samuel Hartwell's reaction to the discovery of Isaiah's disappearance, as recorded in multiple contemporaneous sources, including letters, official reports, and later testimony, was nothing short of explosive, a fury that swept through the plantation like wildfire and left no corner of the estate untouched by its intensity. According to the overseer's log, Hartwell immediately ordered a comprehensive search of the entire plantation, demanding that every building be examined, every potential hiding place investigated, from the barns and storage sheds to the smokehouse, the root cellars, and even the small spaces beneath the main house where tools and seasonal equipment were kept. The entire enslaved population was assembled in the area between the main house and the quarters, and for hours they were interrogated individually and collectively about what they might have seen or heard during the night, with Hartwell pacing among them and demanding answers that none could or would provide. Patrol riders were dispatched before noon to neighboring plantations, with instructions to search any suspicious locations and to question the enslaved populations there about whether they had seen a man matching Isaiah's distinctive physical description. The county sheriff was notified, and by the following day, notices had been placed in the Richmond papers offering a substantial reward for information leading to Isaiah's capture and return, describing him in detail and warning that he was considered dangerous. Yet despite the intensity and thoroughness of these efforts, the search yielded absolutely nothing. No trace of Isaiah, no credible sightings, no evidence of where he might have gone, or how he might have achieved such an impossible escape. Perhaps more disturbing to Samuel Hartwell than even the disappearance itself was the discovery that his wife had locked herself in her chambers and refused to speak with him, ignoring his increasingly forceful demands that she open the door and explain her behavior. A letter written by Margaret's sister Catherine, dated August 25th, and discovered among the Richmond family correspondence, responding to a missive from Margaret that has since been lost, expresses profound shock and concern over the situation that Margaret had apparently described, though the sister's careful language suggests she was deeply troubled by implications she dared not state explicitly in written form. The item that the overseer had initially overlooked in his shock at discovering Isaiah's disappearance, the small object lying in the dirt near the base of the central post, became the subject of intense scrutiny 3 days later, when it was finally documented in an official county sheriff's report filed on August 21st, 1839, a document that now resides in the Madison County Courthouse archives and represents one of the few surviving pieces of official documentation related to the case. The item was a small leather pouch, darkened with age and wear, secured with a simple drawstring that had been pulled tight. When Sheriff Thomas Whitmore opened the pouch in the presence of Samuel Hartwell and 2 witnesses, the contents proved to be far more incriminating than anyone present could have anticipated. Inside the pouch was found, first, a lock of auburn hair tied with a thin ribbon, the particular shade of auburn that precisely matched the color of Margaret Hartwell's hair, a fact that several people present were in a position to verify. Second, there was a folded piece of paper that, when carefully opened, revealed a hand-drawn map bearing an almost identical rendering to the one for which Isaiah had been punished just days earlier, showing roads leading north from the plantation toward the Rappahannock River and beyond into Maryland. Third, and perhaps most damning of all, was a gold ring inscribed on its inner surface with the Hartwell family crest, a distinctive design featuring an oak tree and the family motto in Latin, the kind of heirloom piece that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the family's history and possessions. The sheriff's report, written in the careful legal language typical of such documents, notes that when shown this evidence and asked to explain how such items might have come to be in Isaiah's possession, Samuel Hartwell's demeanor changed dramatically from cooperation to rage. According to the report, Hartwell became visibly enraged, his face flushing red as he shouted that the items had obviously been planted by abolitionist agitators seeking to create scandal and destroy the reputation of respectable families, and he demanded that the investigation be closed immediately, threatening to use his considerable political influence to ensure that the sheriff's career would suffer if he continued to pursue a case built on such obviously fabricated evidence. On September 3, 1839, exactly 16 days after Isaiah's disappearance from the cornfield, the Hartwell plantation experienced a second vanishing that would prove equally mysterious and far more difficult for Samuel Hartwell to explain to his neighbors and the wider community. Margaret Hartwell was discovered missing from the plantation early that morning, when the housemaid arrived with breakfast and found the mistress's chamber door, which had remained locked from the inside for days, now standing open. According to the housekeeper's later testimony, recorded in a deposition taken in 1872, Margaret's belongings remained largely untouched in her room, her wardrobe still filled with dresses, her jewelry box undisturbed on the dressing table, and her personal effects arranged exactly as they had been the previous evening. However, a small traveling case that normally resided in the back of her closet was missing, as were several personal items, including a miniature portrait of her mother, a Bible that had been a wedding gift, and the everyday clothing one might pack for a journey of uncertain duration. No note was left behind, no letter of explanation placed on the writing desk, no message conveyed to the household staff about her intentions or destination. A search was conducted through the plantation grounds and the immediate surrounding area. But unlike the extensive and aggressive manhunt that had been launched for Isaiah, This investigation was brief, perfunctory, and concluded within 2 days with no real answers. Samuel Hartwell told neighbors and visiting acquaintances that his wife had gone to stay with family in Charleston, South Carolina, due to ill health, claiming that the Virginia climate had proven too taxing for her constitution and that she required the care of relatives while she recovered. However, subsequent research into Charleston, records from the period, reveals no documentation of Margaret's arrival in that city, no hotel registries bearing her name, no mention of her presence in the correspondence of Charleston relatives. More tellingly, letters from her sister Catherine in Richmond, written in late September and October of 1839, express increasing confusion and concern over Margaret's whereabouts, asking mutual acquaintances if they had received any word from her, and noting that she had seemingly vanished without maintaining contact with any member of her own family. In 1889, 50 years after the mysterious events at the Hartwell plantation, a historian named William Still, himself a former conductor on the Underground Railroad and author of several works documenting the secret network that had helped thousands escape bondage, conducted a series of interviews with elderly individuals who had participated in the dangerous work of guiding fugitives to freedom. Among those interviewed was a woman in Philadelphia who gave her name only as Ruth, claiming to be in her 80s, and stating that she had served as a conductor on a route that passed through central Virginia during the 1830s and 1840s, operating primarily in the region between Richmond and the Rappahannock River. Ruth's testimony, preserved in Still's unpublished notes that were discovered in the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in 1967, described a case that had become legendary among those involved in the Underground Railroad network, a story passed down and recounted at gatherings of former conductors and station masters as an example of the extraordinary risks some people were willing to take for love and freedom. According to Ruth's account, in August of 1839, she had been contacted through the network's established channels about a couple who needed to be moved north with extreme urgency and secrecy, a couple unusual in that one was enslaved and the other was free, a white woman of considerable social standing who had chosen to abandon everything she knew to flee with the man she loved. Ruth stated that the escape had been planned meticulously over a period of months and had required the assistance of someone with intimate knowledge of the plantation's operations, its routines, its vulnerabilities, and the movements of its overseers. The elderly conductor explained that the couple had been instructed to travel separately for the first 3 days of their journey using different routes and maintaining no contact with each other to reduce the risk of capture should one be discovered. They reunited, according to Ruth's recollection, at a safe house operated by free black farmers near Fredericksburg, where they remained hidden for 2 days before continuing their journey together through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, eventually reaching Philadelphia, where the network helped them establish new identities and begin a life that would have been impossible in the Virginia they had left behind. In 2003, more than a century and a half after the events at the Hartwell plantation, a discovery in upstate New York would provide tantalizing evidence that might finally answer the questions that had haunted historians for generations. During renovations of a historic home in Seneca Falls, a town with deep connections to both the abolitionist movement and the early struggle for women's rights, construction workers removing deteriorated sections of the attic discovered a hidden compartment built into the space between the roof beams and the ceiling of the floor below. Inside this compartment, carefully wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture and decay, were several items including 2 journals bound in worn leather, their pages yellowed with age but still remarkably legible. The journals, which were immediately turned over to local historical societies and subsequently authenticated by historians at Cornell University using paper analysis, ink testing, and handwriting comparison with known documents from the period, were written by two different individuals who identified themselves only through initials rather than full names. The first journal was kept by someone who signed entries as I.M., written in the same careful but self-taught hand that appeared on the unsigned letters discovered at the Hartwell plantation site in 1978. The second journal bore entries signed M.H., penned in an educated script that matched the letters signed with the initial M from that same archaeological discovery. The journals documented a life together, spanning from 1840 to 1867, describing in intimate detail a marriage that had clearly been forged under extraordinary circumstances, the birth and raising of 3 children, their active work with the abolitionist movement in upstate New York, and their quiet but determined efforts to help other fugitives find freedom. Throughout both journals, there were oblique references that seemed to point back to Virginia, to tobacco fields stretching under summer sun, to a night storm that had threatened but never arrived, to ropes that had been severed by hands that loved rather than restrained. Yet despite these suggestive details, the writers never explicitly named the plantation from which they had fled, never identified Samuel Hartwell, never provided the kind of concrete confirmation that would definitively link their story to the mystery of August 1839, maintaining a careful silence about their past, even in private writings that they presumably never expected anyone else to read. Samuel Hartwell lived for 22 more years after the dual disappearances that had shattered his world, finally succumbing to pneumonia in March of 1861, just months before the Civil War would reach Virginia and transform the entire society he had known into something unrecognizable. His final years, documented through surviving correspondence held in various archives and through legal records preserved in Madison County, revealed a man fundamentally altered by the events of August and September 1839, consumed by a bitterness that seemed to deepen with each passing year rather than softening with time. He never remarried, despite being a man of considerable wealth and property, never entertained suitors, or showed the slightest interest in forming new social connections that might have led to matrimony. According to letters written by neighbors and business associates, Hartwell never spoke publicly about his wife's disappearance, refusing to discuss Margaret even when directly asked about her whereabouts by those who had known the couple. He became increasingly isolated from his community, declining invitations to social gatherings, rarely attending church services, and conducting his business affairs through intermediaries whenever possible, rather than engaging with his peers in person. His will, probated in Madison County in April of 1861, was a lengthy document that distributed his considerable estate among distant relatives, but it contained one clause that legal scholars and historians would later find particularly extraordinary. Hartwell had set aside a substantial sum, the equivalent of nearly $50,000 in contemporary currency, to fund continued searches for information about the events of August 1839, with specific instructions that investigators be hired to pursue any leads about Isaiah's disappearance and Margaret's whereabouts. However, the will contained an additional provision that any findings resulting from these searches were to be sealed from public record for 100 years after his death, locked away in the Madison County Courthouse vault, where neither curiosity nor historical inquiry could access them until 1961, when that sealed file was finally opened by county officials and representatives from the Virginia Historical Society on the appointed date. It was found to contain only a single document, a letter written in Margaret's distinctive hand, addressed to no one, explaining nothing about where she had gone or why, but asking repeatedly for forgiveness in words that suggested she understood the magnitude of what she had done, yet wouldn't have chosen differently, even knowing the cost. The case of Isaiah and Margaret Hartwell remains officially unsolved to this day, classified in historical records as a double disappearance with suspected abolitionist involvement, one of dozens of similar cases from the antebellum period that continue to resist definitive explanation despite the application of modern investigative techniques and forensic analysis. Modern examination of the evidence has yielded some answers while simultaneously raising new questions that may never be satisfactorily resolved. DNA testing, conducted in 2004 on the lock of auburn hair found in the leather pouch, confirmed a familial connection to Margaret Hartwell's verified descendants living in Charleston, proving beyond doubt that the hair had indeed belonged to her, and lending credibility to the theory that she had willingly given it to Isaiah as a token of affection. The journals discovered in Seneca Falls have been studied extensively by linguists and historians, with analysis suggesting that the male writer identified as I.M. had learned to read and write as an adult rather than receiving childhood education, while the female writer, signing as M.H., demonstrated formal education entirely consistent with upper-class Southern women of the period. The severed ropes, carefully preserved in the climate-controlled archives of Madison County, have been examined by forensic specialists who determined that the cut marks were consistent with a blade that had been sharpened specifically for the purpose of cutting through thick hemp, suggesting careful premeditation rather than an opportunistic escape made with whatever implement happened to be available. Yet despite all this evidence, what remains fundamentally unclear is how such an elaborate escape could have been successfully executed while Isaiah was supposedly under intensive watch, bound in a location visible from multiple vantage points during a period when plantation security had been heightened to prevent exactly this kind of disappearance. The question of whether the couple who lived quietly in Seneca Falls, raising their children and working for abolition, truly were the vanished pair from Virginia, or whether that connection is simply what modern historians want to believe about a mystery that challenges everything previously understood about the supposedly rigid and insurmountable boundaries of the antebellum South, remains a matter of interpretation rather than established fact, leaving the story suspended between documented history and enduring legend.